So welcome everyone. Just if I could ask the room manager, are we now live? Can we start? I'll assume we're live. Maybe Rose on a different device, you can just see if the live stream is working and then ping us and then rep us if it's somehow not working. Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, morning, evening to everyone, and welcome to the World Data Forum session on data and children, gaps, opportunities, and responsibilities. I would like to extend a sincere thank you to our panelist speakers and participants for joining us today online and in person. I see some of you in the room now. I would also like to thank the co-organizers of this panel, in particular the Governance Laboratory at New York University, the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move at UNICEF, and NORRAG at the Geneva Graduate Institute. My name is Daniel Shepard. I'll be the moderator for today. I'm the Missing Data Project Lead at NORRAG, which is an associate program of the Geneva Graduate Institute in Switzerland. This session discusses the important topic of data and children, as you all know, if you're here with us today. And we're particularly interested in discussing together the role of partnerships to address gaps in data availability, in ethical use of data, and in its just governance. So without further ado, I would like to just introduce to you our first speaker and the first question. And as we're moving along in the interest of time, we have a Google document that's open to all in which you can write your questions. So you can put your questions into there and we'll provide written responses. That way, if we run out of time, we can still get to everyone's questions. And I'll paste that link into the chat in just a moment. So the first question is really around what is, from your perspective and your work, the important gap when it comes to data and children? And what are some promising initiatives or approaches that you see for addressing it in your work? And so I'd like to start with Dr. Stefan Verhulst, who's the co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of the Governance Laboratory at NYU. So Stefan.
Great.
And we can close that slide, Rose.
Sure. Thanks so much, Daniel, for convening us here, and a pleasure being with you all there in the World Data Forum. And as it relates to the specific gap, our work has focused on the gap as it relates to data governance. And first of all, we came to the realization that a lot of the discussion about children and data was focused on how do we prevent the misuse of data as it relates to children, which I think is fundamentally important. But at the same time, we also realized by actually solely focusing on the misuse, we also ignored the misuses. And we all are here at the World Data Forum because we obviously have a certain belief that data can do good if done in a responsible way. And so what we have tried to focus on is the gap between the governance approach that seeks to prevent the misuse and then the approaches that are needed in order to prevent the misuses as such. That's the first area. The second, I would say, is that obviously you cannot address the gap between mis and misuses from a governance perspective without also taking into account the unique characteristics of children, especially as it relates to data. And so in our work, which is the Responsible Data for Children initiative that we have developed with UNICEF, we approach children and data and the concerns that might be associated with the use of data from 8 perspectives. And I'm not going to go through all the 8, but it suffices to say that, first of all, children quite often have not the level of agency in determining how the data is being used as in other situations. Secondly, quite often the use of data, and especially the violation of data, might have a fundamental impact on the self-development of children as well. And so it's very important to realize that the misuse and the misuses of data is not just about improving service provision, but it also can have an impact on self-development of children itself. And then thirdly, we also realized that quite often, especially children that are already in vulnerable situations, quite often are being asked to share data on an ongoing basis, which basically reinforces trauma as well. And so for those, anyway, we'll have 5 other reasons why we feel like there is a need for a dedicated approach to actually monitoring and managing children and data, which is why we created the Responsible Data for Children initiative that, as I mentioned, seeks to prevent the misuse for all the reasons I've given, but also prevents the misuses. And so I can go into detail what we've tried to do, but that was, Daniel, hopefully a short answer to your question on what was the gap in the space.
Thank you so very much for that, Stefan. And to that point of misuse and misuses, I wonder, Australia, if you could reflect on your own work with Children on the Move and how that has manifested with this question around what are important gaps. So Australia Lajoma is joining us. She's the coordinator of the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, which is led by UNICEF's Division of Data Analytics and Planning.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction, and good morning from New York. Thanks to all who are joining us in Hangzhou and also online. I will begin by flagging the concerning lack of reliable, timely, and disaggregated data on children on the move. We know that in recent years, the numbers of migrant and displaced children have reached record highs. This includes 13.7 million asylum-seeking and refugee children, 25.5 million internally displaced children, and 35.5 million international migrant children. But many of the numbers that we have are estimates with large uncertainty bounds and inherent limitations. And given that so many of these children are in highly precarious situations, we need better data to more effectively allocate resources and to design policies that can protect them. And we need to strengthen national data collection processes, promote disaggregation of data, improve estimation and modeling techniques, monitor development targets using common indicators, and find ways to harness non-traditional data sources. And these efforts must be undertaken in a responsible manner. This is why the IDAC, or the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, was launched in 2020 after the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. It offers a platform for peer learning, co-creating solutions, and partnership building. And it seeks to improve the availability, analysis, sharing, and use of data to inform policy and programming, and ensure that children on the move are not left behind. But why are these children often missed or overlooked in data collection efforts and in social statistics? Reasons for these shortcomings include a lack of political will, limited technical capacity, and human and financial resources, and poor coordination across national statistical systems. 3 minutes is too short to unpack all these challenges, Daniel, but a key issue to raise is the fact that across contexts, terminology related to migration and displacement is not standardized. Furthermore, the data sources, tools, and methods that can help governments enhance the data on children are not being systematically utilized. To be able to count these children, we first need to pinpoint which subgroups of child populations are included in the broad term children on the move, and effectively leverage the data sources that identify them. So to that end, IDAC has produced a brief on the move, entitled Children on the Move, Key Terms, Definitions, and Concepts, which you will see on screen, hopefully, with a conceptual framework that we have offered. It is nearing finalization, and we're eager to share that with the international community. So you can see it's a compound concept that includes children who have been directly or indirectly affected by migration or displacement, either internationally across borders or within the same country. In the term, we also include children migrants, children in need of international protection, such as refugees and asylum seekers, internally displaced children, children left behind due to migration of parents, stateless children, and child victims of cross-border trafficking. So just to cite an example, the latest global outlook indicates there are 36.5 million children displaced by conflict and violence, but this number includes children, refugees, and other children in need of international protection, but excludes those who have been internally displaced due to disasters, who are estimated at around 2.4 million. Different agencies define forced displacement differently, which can lead to confusion about which children are included and excluded in the estimate. So in sum, which children are counted and how these numbers are communicated matter. If we don't work together to coordinate and plan data collection, analysis, sharing, and dissemination carefully and inclusively, we risk leaving millions of children on the move behind. And so an alliance like an IDAC is very important in doing so. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Australia, for that. And on the topic of children on the move, I would like to invite comments on this question from Alana Wang, who is the co-director of the Migration, Children, and Youth platform at the Major Group for Children and Youth. So, Alana.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So for those of you who don't know us, we are the largest youth constituency organization that works to facilitate meaningful and representative inclusion and engagement of young people at high-level decision-making processes, specifically in migration issues. So from our perspective, as Australia actually already mentioned, the lack of sufficient, accurate, and transparent data, particularly for children and youth on the move, is a significant and urgent gap. But I want to highlight 3 causes of this that we feel need addressing, which contributes directly to this gap. So first, the lack of disaggregated data across categories such as age, gender, living situation, and being in and out of school. This is especially important for young people as livelihoods, needs, and experiences change in shorter amounts of time compared to later in life. Think about differences in changes between 5 to 10 years old and 40 to 50s. So these are just one of the reasons that data is not as accurate on youth and children to move. Second, the lack of safety ensured and community-grounded data collection processes remains a barrier. So this is a big problem for accurate data collection with vulnerable and marginalized communities. For example, migrant communities, but particularly refugees, stateless, undocumented peoples, but it also applies to populations like unhoused people as well. So a fear of discrimination, other negative repercussions, such as being reported to authorities or facing other forms of community-based backlash, for instance, can result in having their data collected wrongly or not having their data collected at all, or worse, providing false information out of fear. And third, a lack of children youth participation in data processes. So this can seem less sort of urgent and necessary than other reasons mentioned today, but not involving young people in data collection analysis about them and their communities risk being unable to reach adequate and representative sample sizes, missing key pieces or categories of data that are important to understanding young people, and misinterpreting data due to lack of experiential knowledge. So I also want to point to IDAC as a key initiative that's working to address these issues, because collaborative and cooperative-based approaches such as this can really help organizations and governments around the world to dedicate the resources and special attention and understanding needed to protect children through data. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana, for those important reflections on the importance of engaging with youth in particular. And so on that point, I'd like to bring in a gendered angle on this work and some of the gaps when it comes to gender and education for children. And so I'd like to invite 2 speakers that are working on the Accountability for Gender Equality in Education project for their perspectives. Professor Elaine Unterhalter, who is the Professor of Education and International Development at UCL Institute of Education, and Professor Lebo Molotsane, who is Professor in the J.L. Dube Chair in Rural Education in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So I'd like to turn over to you to share your reflections, and I know that you have done some work also engaging with young people in your work.
Thanks very much, Daniel, and thanks for the opportunity to join with people all around the world to think about this important issue. I think from the point of view of the AGEE project, which I coordinate with others in universities in a number of different countries, one of the important gaps is around gender, and the way that gender is understood for children has very long been marked by a straight binary understanding. Children are either male or female, and then you pack in other components of disaggregation. But the complexity of gender relations is what fails to be noticed for children. And I think it manifests itself in two ways in relation to the discussion of data in relation to children in and out of school. For children who are in school, gender is almost always discussed in terms of whether they're enrolled or school, whether they progress through school, or what their learning outcomes are. So gender is always, enrollment statistics are broken down by gender. Sometimes you will get information on other social divisions, but it's very often crudely done. And for children out of school, the major defining feature is that they're out of school, not the complexity of their social relations. And in all but a handful of countries, it's very difficult to tie together the statistical information on children in households and the social relations that surround that, and the administrative data that links to schooling. And I know they're very complex governance issues to be confronted about that. But what that means is that there's a kind of default to the notion that gender parity is the only measure of, the only analytic measure, rather than more complex measures. And what we have developed in the AGEE project, which is the slide that I think Rose is going to show you, is a framework, a conceptual framework for thinking about gender in more complex ways. So not only thinking about gender parity, but thinking about the complex ways in which gender relations are formed and themselves intersect with other relationships. And these have a bearing on the resources, both the financial and the policy resources, the values that are both legally enshrined and socially enacted, the opportunities or lack of opportunities for entering and progressing through school and remaining safe in that, aspects of looking at gender in participation in education, which tends to be the area in which there's been the most data development, data looking at the development of knowledge, understanding, and skills, not just in the areas of mathematics, reading, arithmetic, reading and writing, but in a broader range of skills that are needed for a flourishing life. And then looking at the outcomes for different children in relation to gender relations. So what the AGEE framework, which is a very flexible framework and can be used in a range of settings, from cross-national to institutional to neighborhood, is that it gives a dashboard for looking at the complexities of gender. And we think the data sources, organizing the existing data sources using the AGEE framework, will yield much richer data for thinking about gender and children. And let me pass now to Lebo.
Yes. One of the areas that the AGEE project focused on is picking up on Ilana's input around children's participation. I'm going to use just as an illustrative case, particularly around children's experiences of high rates of gender-based violence, but also physical violence in the home, the community, and in the schools. So in South Africa, while we know from available research that 1 in 3 children experience sexual abuse before the age of 18, and that rates of physical violence, including murder, are similarly high, from our experience of working in rural communities, we also have become too aware that how difficult it is to document violence in rural communities, and especially how challenging it is to generate data with children and young people. Doing any kind of research in rural communities in many African contexts is challenging for a variety of reasons, including the costs related to travel distances, poor transport infrastructure and services, and the need for more research and support in terms of labor and resources such as time. So in particular, doing research with children in these communities is even more challenging for reasons including the nervousness, of course, of university ethics committee around traumatizing or re-traumatizing children, and the positions of children, particularly girls in these rural communities. So their voices are often missing from the data that we have. And this data, it is our belief that it is important in terms of understanding the children's experiences of violence from their own perspective, particularly their experiences of sexual abuse and physical violence in the home, the school, and the community. And you can imagine the difficulties of getting that data. So what has worked in the past few years of our work in rural South Africa to try and address this gap, which most donors prioritize in terms of prioritizing survey research over other kinds of research. For us, community-based participatory research seems to work better in terms of working with children. And this type of research uses methods that enable children to speak about these difficult experiences that they are often silenced from speaking about. As you can imagine, this is both time-consuming and expensive, and very few donors or funders are prepared to invest in them. And so funding is difficult to access. And we can talk later about how we try to work around these difficulties.
Thank you very much, Lebo and Elaine. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Jeffrey Burnett, who is Assistant Professor of Economics at Rochester Institute of Technology, to bring in a perspective on data and children and gaps when it comes to indigenous peoples, who themselves have historically been forcibly displaced many times from their own lands, and connects to some of these issues of mis and misuse data that we've been discussing.
Thank you, Daniel. I would say that one of the biggest issues is just one of inclusion in the process. And really the issue being that indigenous people and indigenous nations are typically not included in those decisions of what data gets collected, how it gets collected, and then also how it gets reported. These end up causing a number of different types of challenges. One of the big issues is who is indigenous. Defining indigeneity becomes a really important issue. External data collection requires indigenous nations first be recognized by colonizing nations and institutions, and those colonizing nations and institutions have played a major role in the marginalization of people. And settler colonialism talks about how there's all these mechanisms put in place to make sure that land is taken and justified, and as a result, there's an incentive to make sure that indigenous people are made invisible. And so who gets to define who is indigenous becomes a really big issue, and how those definitions can be used over time to create false narratives becomes a bit of an issue as well. One of the other issues involves global intersectionality, right? So the issue is that indigenous nations span all different regions around the world, and a lot of the focus tends to be on obtaining missing gaps within data, but indigenous nations face a lot of problems within global northern countries like the United States and other countries that a lot of times we don't focus a lot of our efforts on kind of developing data collection specifically for that. Along with that, as I mentioned before, colonizing data practices become a bit of an issue, where what's happened is we just use the current data collection practices of the global north and replicate them in other parts of the world. The issue being that data collection and survey questions tend not to be designed to serve the needs of indigenous nations or indigenous people. They're not part of the data collection questions, and therefore collecting information that is specifically meant to impact their communities in a positive way. Indigenous nations and people tend to possess a lot of the characteristics that a lot of our panelists have already talked about in general, being that they're historically marginalized. And this results in a lot of missing and unreliable data within national surveys in countries that have well-developed data collection processes, right? So we have issues of small sample sizes, rural location, participation, and if indigenous people don't see the benefit of that data collection, what happens is they a lot of times will not participate in that process. And so there's a lot of efforts being put in place to focus in on the responsible data collection. And I really do appreciate the other panelists making sure to talk about that responsibility. There are what they call care principles that are put in place, talking about the collective benefit of data collection for indigenous people, maintaining the authority to ensure that indigenous nations and indigenous people have the right to maintain that data and have access to it, ensuring that those who are working with indigenous data have a responsibility to share that data to allow and promote self-determination of indigenous people. And then also, lastly, ensuring that data collection on indigenous people is done in an ethical way. Those are all things that I'll build off of when we get to the next question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you all for those provoking reflections on gaps and some promising initiatives. And so on that latter point of promising initiatives, I'd like for each of you to reflect a bit more on the role of partnerships in addressing these gaps when it comes to children, their well-being, and also their caregivers, and what you are all doing and you are all working with to address this through partnerships. So Stefan, could you share your thoughts from the work of GovLab, especially through the lens of partnership?
Yeah, sure. And I think, first of all, there is a need for coordination and collaboration for a variety of reasons. And I think the first reason is that data is not a thing, especially if we look at data for children. It is a process that involves a whole range of actions, but more importantly, a whole range of actors that are instigating those actions, whether it's about collection, whether it's about where data is being stored or processed, whether it's around how it's being analyzed and by whom, or whether it's about how subsequently the insight is being used, whether it's by caregivers or others. And so because we have so many actors across the data lifecycle, we feel that there is need for collaboration across those actors as it relates to applying common principles on how the data is being handled or how the data is being collected in the first place. And so that's the first reason why we feel there's need for collaboration as it relates to the use of common principles, which of course we have tried to develop under the rubric of the Responsible Data for Children principles. But then the second reason why there is need for collaboration is because when we're talking about children, and especially providing services to children and leveraging data to improve those services, then obviously there are a whole range of different service providers that need to collaborate and again adopt similar kind of common principles on how data is being used in order to inform the way they go about services. So collaboration is key, not only because there are many actors across the data lifecycle, not only because there are many service providers, but also because quite often the data is vastly dispersed. And so you also need collaboration across the data holders and then the ones that actually need access to the data. And that's where, at least as GovLab, we've done a lot of work around creating data collaboratives, where you actually bring the data that already exists to the table in a responsible way, using those common principles in order for those that need access to the data to have subsequently access and be able to reuse that as well. And so these are just 3 reasons why I believe collaboration is key in this space. And I leave it up to the others to perhaps provide concrete examples also on how that can happen as well.
Thank you, Stefan. And especially on that point of collaboration, I mean, to bridge gaps between different silos of data systems, I wonder if you can share some reflections, Australia, from your work with children on the move and the role of partnerships.
Thank you, Daniel. I will second what Stefan said about the importance of coordination. As you know, national data ecosystems involve many sectors and actors that produce, collect, analyze, and use data and statistics. So promoting a whole of government and the whole of society approach is crucial for filling child-specific data gaps and needs in the context of migration and displacement. And partnership is the heart of this approach, involving national data actors, non-state partners, civil society organizations, the private sector, the youth themselves, and international organizations that are mandated to assist governments with issues related to the protection and empowerment of migrant and displaced children. And as I alluded to earlier, the lack of standard methodologies and data approaches across countries and regions must be addressed. We must build on existing frameworks and processes that build governments' capacities to strengthen their data systems, and we must promote the sharing of good practices and lessons learned between and among national data actors. IDAC, the expert group on refugee, internally displaced people and statelessness statistics, or IGRIS, and the expert group on migration statistics are good examples of such partnerships. Using IDAC as an example, as a cross-sectoral partnership that brings together the different national, regional, and global stakeholders to advance discussions on data, indicators, and methodologies, and how they are intimately linked to the risks and vulnerabilities of different groups of children. By pooling the diverse expertise and resources of its members, IDAC produces thematic and data-driven publications, develops and offers child-focused guidance materials and tools for data producers and users, and convenes online meetings and consultations around emerging issues, such as the impact of climate change on children's safety and movement, as we did in January on the heels of the 3rd International Forum on Migration Statistics in Santiago. A partnership like IDAC also strengthens the call for systemic investments in data work, even though it is difficult, even though it is expensive. This is especially important today when resources are becoming increasingly limited. Now, more than ever, we need solid evidence to guide duty bearers and policymakers. So on this note, I invite participants to join the IDAC's Global Pledge towards better data for children on the move, and commit to 5 key actions to protect and empower children who are displaced or are moving or have been forced out of their homes. So you will see their 5 action points: disaggregate data by age, sex, and migratory status, collect data on key issues related to children on the move, make better use of whatever existing data we have and share it, coordinate data collection efforts within countries and across borders, and make special efforts to collect and analyze data on children. This pledge was developed and co-launched with our youth partner, the Migration, Youth and Children Platform, which is represented today by Elana as co-director. That's it for now, Daniel. I'm happy to add later.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Australia. Yeah, and Alana, I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well, the role of partnerships, especially through the work you've done through youth constituencies.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Daniel. And so, yes, as Australia and Stefan already detailed, partnerships are really important because it assists with the very much needed lack of data coordination addressing it. But I think from our perspective as a constituency, it also plays a number of other roles as well, which ties into this. So first, it ensures the on-ground realities of both children, particularly from marginalized backgrounds and vulnerable communities, and their caregivers and support structures are factored into data processes. And second, it ensures through partnering with youth-led, grassroots, and other on-ground organizations and communities that they're able to both input into and lead data processes in ways that are that are relevant, safe, but also allows for self-determination, as some of the other speakers said earlier. That's really, really important, because how you're portrayed, how you are identified as well, is something that can play into many, many different experiences. It can lead from being put in dangerous situations, but all can lead to empowerment. So having communities lead this discussion and lead this self-identification, self-determination is really, really important. And they're also crucial to sharing and disseminating data for optimal usage amongst governments, development international agencies, and other stakeholders. So I think one of the things that everyone here agrees on is that there's a lot of data out there, but the accuracy and how they are used, how they're optimized, is something that is still really missing. And there's a lot of duplication efforts, a lot of gaps in areas where we can coordinate better, and hopefully partnerships is one key way to do this. So I want to briefly touch on what Estrella mentioned earlier as well, with the survey that we launched, which was specifically for young people to provide with insights on general questions on data. So from here, we presented the key insights of the outcome at the lead up on the International Forum Migration Statistics, as well as the annual conference of the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, which both took place earlier this year. And we saw a lot of interest, as well as further understanding on why these partnerships, these self-community-led data processes are really important. And over 90% of our respondents believe that it was necessary for children and youth to participate in data processes. 45% thought that governments should urgently enhance youth participation or encourage the development of youth-led organizations in order to improve data. And that was from a question that just asked, what do you think is one of the most necessary things to do? And so the fact that so many pointed to this specifically shows how much people really believe that governments need to continue and enhance this engagement, participation of youth and other communities. And so whilst we work on ensuring further reach of young people around the world, a challenge that will continue due to the digital divides, due to community trust building exercise, or that kind of thing, it really clearly showed our interest in engaging on this topic in a number of young people who want to use their passion, their innovation, and technical skills as well to become data leaders for their communities.
That's wonderful. And for the interested listeners, we'll be sharing some links where you can access these materials, such as those survey results and the other work of the different partnerships, so that you can dig into more details. So I'd like to turn it now to Elaine and Lebeau to share your thoughts on the importance of partnerships through the work of AGEE.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And like the other speakers, what partnership and collaboration and coordination has been a key element in setting up the AGEE project and the consultations, both on developing the framework that I showed earlier, as well as thinking about the use of data, selecting indicators, and assessing them. So we've seen partnerships both in relation to the cross-national AGEE framework, which is already quite far advanced with the selection of indicators and the development of a composite indicator, and in discussions around national dashboards using the AGEE framework, in which typically we've consulted with departments of education, departments of women and youth, academics who work on gender and education issues, gender activists, people involved in the National Statistical Office and the EMIS office. So that's quite a conventional alliance, but they've been very useful in ensuring that the data we're using is accurate and that it, under each of the fields of the AGEE framework, we are selecting the most appropriate indicators. But there's another aspect that has become important in the AGEE work, and I think this only emerged from the partnerships, because a lot of data describes the world as it is. It describes, its injustices, its efforts towards equality in relation to gender equality. What's a much harder exercise, and which has been posed to us very sharply through the various consultative exercises we've done, both in relation to the cross-national dashboard and the national dashboard, is thinking about what a transformation of unjust gender relations might look like, and what kind of data you would need to collect in order to know that that is emerging. And so it's thinking about that transformatory process and putting down placeholders for the kind of data that we might want, or the kind of indicator that would indicate that something was emerging, that was promising. And it's that the participatory processes have been really crucial for, because thinking outside the box is not that easy for academics who are looking so close at what's going on. It's not that easy for civil servants who have to gather together and process information on what's now. It's that imagination to think about how we can change things. And I think that's an additional really important element of partnership that we've been very privileged to gain through the AGEE project, often with working with young people who have got very different perspectives to those of older people in more established positions in relation to data. Thanks, and let me pass to you, Libo.
Yes, so I want to pick up on addressing some of the data challenges I talked about earlier, and using, again, South Africa as an illustrative example. So within South African rural context, while our focus is mainly to privilege the voices of children as knowledgeable and agentic beings, we also believe that obtaining data that will lead to gender transformation is not possible without collaborations and partnerships with their rural communities, as well as local and community-based NGOs and institutions such as schools and churches and others. This has worked for us is transnational collaborations with researchers who are doing research with children and young people in marginalized communities in South Africa and other countries, both in Africa and the global north, and forming alliances between our rural communities and those in the north who face similar marginalizations in their own communities. And picking up on Jeffrey's point around indigenous communities, in our recent projects that titled Networks for Change and Wellbeing, Girl-Led Policy Making to Address Sexual Violence. It involved a sort of learning and building together partnership between universities and indigenous communities in Canada and South Africa in addressing sexual violence against girls and young women in our two countries. Some of the areas that we focused on in our partnership project included indigenous and African ethics, so that we can speak back to the university ethics committees around doing research with children. Also included indigenous and African informed research methodologies for working with children and their communities. And I can share some of the outputs from the research project for more information if you are interested in this partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Lebo, and you did my job for me transitioning to Jeff and the importance of engaging with indigenous communities and indeed learning across different contexts, learning the North, learning from the South, and the South learning from the North. It goes both ways. So Jeff, I would like to turn it to you to share your reflections on the importance of partnerships, which you've already started broaching in your previous remarks. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, everybody. So as I was saying, but no one could hear, one of the things that's so important about partnerships and networks is that, especially for Indigenous people, is it helps ensure that the data doesn't just focus on defining Indigenous people as problems. A lot of times the focus of data that's already out there and existing is interested in essentially saying that there's a disparity between Indigenous people and the dominant population. There is some sort of gap that needs to be addressed, and it helps define Indigenous people as the problem. Whereas a lot of these networks instead that are in existence, for example, there's the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, there's the U.S. Data Sovereignty, Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, that's working to bring communities together. It allows each individual nation or community to focus on the data that is most important to it, and also to help them decide, okay, what are the things that are going to allow us to demonstrate the great things that we're doing and not just defining us as a negative in respective to the dominant population. But that being said, it also allows networking to take place and scholars to discuss these questions, shaping how they interrogate existing data that's out there. And so what you have up on the screen here is a good example of how data itself that's already in existing can create narratives that other people from outside the community are maybe not going to notice or think of as being important. So in the United States, the K-12 population can be defined in a certain way, and it was from 2000 to about 2009, where what happened is people were asked to identify as one box. They had to pick that they're an American Indian, black, white, what one particular race or one particular identity group. Starting in 2010, every single school reported that same data, but asked individuals to reflect the complexity of their identity. And what happened is there were two questions instead of one, and American Indians were no longer defined the way that they were. They were only defined as single race, non-Hispanic. And this led to a reduction in the total number of American Indians, but not just that, but also the percentage of American Indians being represented from that point on. And that can start to create this idea that American Indians are no longer around, that they're a vanishing people. And so that was within one particular data set. Having the ability to go look at another data set that's collected not by the National Center for Education Statistics, but by the census, I was able to go ahead and demonstrate that this was not the case where Indigenous students were going away, that this was just a particular issue of redefining who is Indigenous. And there were people that raised this as a particular issue, but again, the Department of Education said what's most important to us is these other principles, making it easy for schools to report the data out, small numbers of data collection is going to be a bit of an issue here. So along with that, we also have these issues of lacking reliable data. As I mentioned before, Indigenous people tend to be in rural locations outside of where data collection is really robust. And so what you see here is a map of the United States mainland and the census's estimation of how good the data is concerning American Indians. And what we see here is the vast majority of the data that's there tends not to be, from the census's own estimation, reliable or high quality data. It tends to be poor quality or low quality data, which are the orange and red spaces. The black spaces are areas where there aren't any data because of the fact that there are no American Indians that are estimated to be living in that particular area. And that gets to a whole nother issue, and that is how many are actually living in those areas. So if you look between the two maps, what you see is the areas that were black in this map, but are no longer black in this next map, are areas where we know, because specifically they've reported themselves to be American Indian and attend this particular school district, that they live in that particular school district. But the survey missed them because of misrepresentation, lack of collaboration with indigenous communities to get them to be willing to participate in the instruments, a whole host of different reasons for why the data is missing. But we can see that this is a significant gap that's in existence for American Indian people in the United States. So that, I would say, is one of the big issues and opportunities and importance of networking.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. And that shows the importance of engaging with different communities, including those that the data are about, to ensure that there's an accurate representation of where they are and what their needs are. So I'd like to, Jeff already kind of began to broach this topic, so I'd like to end with just a quick 1-minute thought on what, from your vantage point, is the major change that would be most useful to improve how we use data for and about children. So we'll keep it to 1 minute, and then we'll have a bit of time to wrap the session up. So Stefan, for you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And so we started the Responsible Data for Children about 5 years ago. And at that moment, there was a fundamental vacuum in the space with regard to how do you handle data around children responsibly in a way that it can be used for children and benefit children as well. And since then, suddenly hopefully as part of some of our efforts, the field has woken up. But what we have seen is now a plethora of approaches, whether it's under the rubric of data ethics or whether in the rubric of data governance, data policies that different organizations in the space have developed. And then you have the new kid on the block, artificial intelligence, and we also have now efforts to develop artificial intelligence principles as it relates to the use of AI for children. All of this is positive, but it also has led to a massive fragmentation and actually confusion in the space on what is it that now applies. And so if there is one change that I would advocate for, is indeed collaboration to settle on a set of common principles that then can be still implemented according to the context and according to the specific needs. But at least there is a better understanding on what are the principles against how my behavior as it relates to the use of data for children will be measured, and how can I use those principles to also really step up and actually handle data in a responsible way. So less fragmentation, more coordination in a way that actually can empower people to start using data for children.
Thank you, Stefan. And Australia.
Today's data revolution presents a unique moment for member states and non-state data actors to tackle the persistent data gaps using innovative approaches, while respecting established statistical principles and honoring the obligation to do no harm and to uphold the best interests for children. But data innovation must also include a child-sensitive lens. This demands an urgent focus on disaggregation of data to help monitor global commitments and ensure better outcomes for highly vulnerable children. We need to start directly engaging youth in our work. We must harness the power and agency of youth themselves to address the data challenges in migration and displacement contexts, particularly when it comes to utilizing technology and innovative data sources to responsibly enhance data for children on the move. Sadly, we know that children will continue to be displaced and forced to move. So as a global community, we need to prepare better. Together with member states, we must galvanize efforts so we can better count as children and be accountable for addressing their protection and development needs. We need to connect and keep talking to share insights, new ideas, good practices, and lessons learned, and amplify each other's efforts in important forums like this World Data Forum. And I know to Daniel that about 100 sessions or events are in place in the 3-day World Data Forum. There are only less than 5 that are child focused. So hopefully in the next WDF, we'll see more conversations taking place around the need for data for children. Thank you.
Thank you, Australia. And Alana, your final thoughts.
Thanks, Daniel. So as Australia actually already mentioned, it is, and one of the reasons that we engage so closely with IDAC is that it is for us to meaningfully engage and ensure participation of children and youth, particularly youth-led and grassroots organizations, in the whole data process. So collection, analysis, and usage, interpretation. And we've already mentioned why this is so important. So I think I'll talk about how it can be achieved and appeal to everyone here as well. For two main ways this can be achieved in everyone's communities. So first, working with the on-ground organizations and community groups to build trust, utilize existing relationships and community leaders who help to ensure that data collection and interpretation processes are framed in a way that respects the agency and are relevant to lived experiences of the community. It also ensures that data holders are trusted by the community and will uphold the protection and self-determination as an integral and non-negotiable priority. So this is something that's incredibly important, especially as Stefan mentioned, as further revolutions coming with AI. And I think without the participation of these communities, this technology could be very easily used in a way that is harmful or dangerous to them. So second is investing resources and funds into building the capacities of youth and migrant organizations to become data process leaders themselves. This not only sets a sustainable way forward for all the crucial changes that I mentioned above, but particularly for youth, it also allows communities to interpret and use the data in collaboration with governments and development agencies, stakeholders to proactively address current and future risk. One young migrant from Uzbekistan who participated in our survey said that what is needed to use data efficiently is to find common tendencies, predict future flows, as it helps to prepare social programs and funding beforehand. So we think this proactivity is something that's really important and it can only be done through meaningful participation. And I think, to be honest, is key to achieving the same sustainable goals themselves. So I want to just leave with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alana. And Elaine and Levo, each of your final thoughts from AGEE's perspective.
The Transforming Education Summit at the UN last September stressed the importance of improving data and building a range of dashboards around gender. And I would like to advocate for people to look at the utility of something like the AGEE framework, seeing gender much more complexly and more intersectionally in thinking about children in school and out of school and the connections between them and the gender relations that surround them. So develop more complex frameworks for thinking about gender, consult on how people understand and see gender transformative processes emerging in education and in the relationships around and through education. And talk, always reflect, and always engage with criterion principles around social justice in relation to thinking about gender. So that's my big wish.
Thank you, Elaine. Levo?
If I were to influence the Ministry of Education in South Africa in terms of using the AGEE framework, it would be that instead of lumping all children as one homogeneous group that needs attention, two things need to happen, focusing on actually obtaining the voices of the children themselves, but making much more of an effort to access the experiences and voices of children in rural communities in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Levo. And Jeff, your final thoughts.
I would wish for more engagement with those communities that are historically marginalized and underserved. I think that we need to get people from those communities to have more of an active role in deciding what data gets collected. And without that, we're not going to have the ability to address the needs of children from those communities. And children from those communities are experiencing more of the problems that are impacting the community in the larger sense. So,
Wonderful, thank you. So I think that's a great note to end on, the importance of partnerships and engaging with communities, perhaps not just to think about what's needed now, but a transformative future for these children around the world. So thank you all for joining us. We've shared some links in the chat. Feel free to reach out to each of us with our email, which Rose will present on the screen, and I think you'll be able to find through the various platforms for the event. So thank you all once again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the World Data Forum, and I hope that next year, as Australia said, we'll have some more sessions on improving data quality for children, as we know that they are a very important constituency and one that is sometimes overlooked. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Danielle, as well, for your excellent moderating.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel.
Yes, thanks, Danielle.
Thanks, Elaine.